In April 2021, the Japanese government announced that the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant will discharge wastewater into the ocean, starting as soon as 2023. This plan, the discharge of more than 1 million tons of processed nuclear wastewater, has raised a few eyebrows across the world and led to many protests against the government. Through today's video, I want to explore why. Why would the Japanese government approve such a proposal that seems so unpopular and controversial? So far, I've mentioned the Japanese government 4 times now, including this one. However, the Japanese government does not deal with the wastewater discharge directly. It's actually TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, initially a privately owned company that was taken over by the Japanese government in 2012 after the 2011 earthquake-caused nuclear disaster. As of today, the Japanese government owns a majority of 55% of TEPCO. Before we can talk about TEPCO's role in this nuclear aftermath, we need to understand that all for-profit companies are set up just for one reason, that is, to generate profit for its shareholders. TEPCO isn't any exception. Founded in 1951 during the United States occupation of Japan, this largest energy provider in Japan brought in more than $50 billion in revenue in 2019 alone. Revenue-wise, it's comparable to Boeing. Like how Boeing's success is attached to the American military and the aviation industry, TEPCO's success had been about how it was able to consistently keep Japan plugged in during its economic rise to become once the second largest economy in the world. Given that Japan is land scarce with minimum resource, TEPCO had been able to keep this world's third largest economy plugged in thanks to one very important technology, that is, nuclear power. Under TEPCO, there are 3 nuclear power plants. Fukushima Daiichi was the earliest one. However, the Daiichi nuclear power plant has proven to be very flawed. As you can see, here is the world map of earthquakes. Japan is here, one of the most active areas for seismic events. I will not go into details about Fukushima tsunami events in this video, nor how nuclear power generation works today. But essentially, this is the core of a nuclear reactor. We utilize the heat emitted from the nuclear reactions contained within this core to generate electricity. The nuclear reactions are extremely powerful. To put that into perspective, if you have a Toyota Corolla in ideal conditions and for some reason that burns wood as efficient as it burns gasoline, 1 kilogram of wood will last you 7 kilometers. That's probably most people's average driving distance to the shop. If you have a normal Corolla that burns actual gasoline, 1 kilogram of gasoline will last you 21 kilometers. That's likely most people's daily commute distance. And if you have a nuclear-powered Corolla, 1 kilogram of uranium fuel will last you 1.77 million kilometers. With that, you can go around the Earth 44 times and see whether your Corolla breaks down first or you run out of fuel first. But it can do this amazing thing with one huge downside. Its reacting materials are extremely dangerous to human health. The nuclear energy gets carried away from the core by water in order to generate electricity, and at the same time, the water also serves as the coolant, so to keep the nuclear reactor cool from overheating, because that would lead to the core not being able to withstand the ultra-high temperature and eventually explode or melt down, exposing its nuclear contaminants to its surrounding environment. In the Fukushima case, the 2011 earthquake was enough to shut down the power generators that were supposed to continuously pump in cooling water to keep the reactor core in stable conditions, and the core was essentially left alone to burn without any cooling. The temperature kept rising and rising until the core material just could not handle it anymore. Explosions or meltdown occurred, and that occurred 3 times. During the earthquake, tsunami brought in a large amount of seawater. The exploded nuclear reactors were directly submerged. All the water that came into contact with the reactor was subsequently contaminated. Fast forward to today, the nuclear disaster is effectively over, and those exploded reactor cores are now submerged in the basement level. Because the basement is under sea level, it naturally attracts nearby seawater and groundwater to flow in because of gravity. In order to prevent the site from overflowing with contaminated water, you must pump out the exact amount of water that flows in. If it's a rainy day, you will need to pump out more water to counter the water ingress because of the rain. TEPCO built 1,000 tanks on site with a total storage of 1.37 million cubic meters. In the beginning, more than 400 tons of water would flow into the basement on a daily basis. In order to avoid having to store that much water every day, TEPCO constructed ice walls around the site to reduce the inflow down to about 100 tons per day. With this rate, one tank will be filled up for every 12 days. Year in and year out, we are now a decade out of the disaster, and the initial storage is now running low for TEPCO. TEPCO is now faced with a dilemma: keep storing more or release it to the environment. As mentioned in the beginning, being a for-profit organization, we can expect TEPCO to prioritize profits for its shareholders. Every shareholder likes profits, with one shareholder being the exception. It's the government. I'm not saying the government does not like money. The difference between a public government and a private shareholder is that the government needs to manage its political risk besides just financial risk. Before the disaster, the Japanese government almost had nothing to do with TEPCO. All the government cares about is that it can keep being elected by the public, so to stay in power. And TEPCO is just one of millions of businesses that conduct business with that public. Then the 2011 nuclear disaster happened. All of a sudden, people are deeply affected by this company's action. The whole nation started to focus on this matter. When one person is yelling on the street, it's likely a crazy person. But if 1,000 people are yelling on the street at the same time, it becomes a political protest. Amid national and even worldwide attention, the Japanese government could not afford any political unrest, especially at a time when this country is under attack by natural disasters. Therefore, the Japanese government had to prevent TEPCO from going bankrupt and injected 1 trillion yen into the company in order to take over. In the short term, the government loses money, but as long as the government stays being the government governing the third largest economy in the world, money really wasn't a concern. However, time drags on, and now we are a decade out. The public is still paying attention, but in comparison to 10 years ago, if there were 1,000 people on the street back then, now there might just be 10 people. In this case, the government can now reconsider whether tying up money with TEPCO is still worth it. From TEPCO's perspective, the government takeover had helped during the compensation payout period, but public ownership would also hinder the long-term growth of this business. TEPCO has never restructured to become a government agency. It is still a company structured in a way so just to make profits. Although Fukushima might be the most famous event associated with TEPCO, TEPCO has many more assets that can actually generate profits, while Fukushima Daiichi has turned into more or less a financial black hole. TEPCO keeps pumping money into this nuclear disaster site, building 1,000 storage tanks, building ice walls, building processing facilities, and so on. The government money will not last forever. The day will come when the government finally pulls out and TEPCO is the one who is left alone with competitors who did not have to deal with the second worst nuclear disaster in human history. So, if we actually wear the shoes of TEPCO shareholders, the release of nuclear wastewater is making so much sense now, because it will get rid of this financially negative asset that drains 150 billion yen per year, which is equivalent to losing 1.6 million customers for TEPCO. Successfully getting rid of this negative asset will make TEPCO shares something attractive to hold in the future. Release into the ocean is most cost effective as well as the hardest to trace. If the release were to contain anything undisclosed or even unethical. After all, the ocean, as we all know, is huge. If we can convince people that Earth is flat, why can't we convince people that any ecological damage caused by the wastewater release is not actually caused by our release? Therefore, I know there are technically many other viable options that would allow the disposal of wastewater in a safer manner, such as bury it deep underground, or freeze it inside concrete and then bury it underground. However, they all cost more money and require more time to execute. What's even worse, if you choose to bury it deep underground, what if something goes wrong at the site? Then everyone will know it's you, TEPCO, who is the one to blame, and you, TEPCO, will have no space for PR maneuver, unlike releasing it into the ocean. In this case, TEPCO shares will almost definitely crash and TEPCO would fail to deliver what it set out to deliver, profits to its shareholders. Watching to this point, I know you sort of enjoyed what I made here. This channel will make an effort to present things that are related to how our humans can sustain ourselves amid mega changes. For every sub to this channel, I'll personally remove 1 kg of CO2 from our atmosphere. Subscribe. I'll present to you another 1 kg CO2 video. Thank you.